Thanks so much for joining us for this evening's program. I'm Christina Linden, the Director of Academic and Public Programs here at the Cantor Arts Center. I am really delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Maia Nuku for the 2026 Ruth K. Franklin Lecture on the Arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. Dr. Nuku, who was born in London, of English and Māori Ngai Tai descent, is a curator for the Arts of Oceania at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where she recently curated a major reinstallation of the Oceania galleries that opened last May. In 2023, which I just learned was about 8 years into the process of the conception and organization of that reinstallation, Dr. Nuku published this beautiful book, Oceania, The Shape of Time, which they do have in the standard libraries. In case you haven't had a chance to see it yet, I will return my copy. And the book was published just in time to accompany a tour of many of the artworks from the Met's collection to Shanghai and Qatar. The book takes as one point of embarkation an idea of the plural present from George Kubler's 1962 book of the same name, The Shape of Time. The variability of shifting relations, passing moments, and changing places are taken into account as Kubler considers how we can restore things to the flow of time. In her book, Dr. Nuku emphasizes the particular relevance of the plural present as a concept for her field of study. She makes a compelling argument, and I quote her conclusion in the book here, that time in Oceania does not exist in discrete units, but within a circular or cyclical order in which past, present, and future can be drawn together into a single unified moment. This phenomenon relies on active encounters between people and the ancestral, and between people and natural worlds. I'm thrilled to have Dr. Nuku here tonight to hear more about the reinstallation, the remarkable artworks it includes, and all the ways she centers Indigenous Pacific artists and storytelling in her practice. Thank you to all of you for being here with us, and please welcome me. Please join me, in welcoming Dr. Nuku.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. And I'd really like to thank Veronica Roberts, John and Jill Friedenreich, Director of the Cantor Arts Centre, and Christina Linden, Director of Academic and Public Programs, for the invitation to join you this evening. It's really great to be here on the West Coast and a real honour to be invited to deliver this year's Ruth K. Franklin Lecture. I'd like to acknowledge the ancestral lands on which we're gathered and the peoples of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and their forebears who have called these coastal lands home and continue to do so today. Ko Maia Nuku aho. I was born and raised in London, England, and have British and Māori ancestry. My father, Geoffrey Jessup, is English from Liverpool, and my mother is Esther Miolka of Māori and Scottish ancestry. And I trace my Māori ancestry through my maternal lineage, through my mother and grandmother. Our iwi and hapu, or tribe and settlement, are on the east coast of the North Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And we descend from Tōrere Nui Arua, the daughter of Hoturoa, captain of the Tainui Waka, or canoe, that made its first landfall on the east coast of New Zealand generations ago. Ko Tainui te Waka, ko Rangiahua te Maunga, ko Wainui te Awa, ko Tōrere Nui Arua te Tipuna, ko Ngai Tai te Iwi, ko Maia Nuku aho. So these are the coordinates of mountain and river which we share at formal gatherings at home in New Zealand. So yes, it's good to be here on the Pacific coast again and know that the waters here connect across to my relations in New Zealand, 6,500 miles away. And I'm grateful for this opportunity to share reflections almost 1 year on the decade-long project to reconstruct, refresh, and reimagine the galleries for the Arts of Oceania as part of the Met's renovation of the Michael C. Rockefeller Wing in New York, which culminated as a week of opening events in May last year. In this foray back in time, I'll reflect on elements of the project to highlight aspects of the museum curatorial practice that many of us who work with Pacific collections are engaged in, and dig into the work we do as advocates and champions, not only of the collections we care for, but also of the artists and communities whose art and life philosophies we seek to elevate. The art we care for within collections, within each of our institutions, is an expression of philosophy. In our case, of oceanic lifeways, which are grounded in quite distinct outlooks in terms of ways of being, of thinking, of moving in this world and beyond it. What does this advocacy look like from inside the museum? How are we trying to shift ground as curators, conservators, collections managers within institutional parameters, and of course with what are often quite limited resources available to us? How do we help facilitate appropriate engagement that does right by the islanders whose cultural heritage we steward? What does the collection need and want? Can we engage audiences so that they are rewarded with opportunities for new kinds of critical thinking, for thinking with the collection as a way to embrace perhaps more embodied or relational forms of knowledge that play with different approaches to knowing? And how might that encourage us in our responses to the world around us and our engagement and entanglement with it? So let's begin at 5:30 a.m. on an auspiciously rainy day on May 29th last year, when delegations who traveled from across the Pacific gathered with community leaders in New York to enact customary protocols to unveil and inaugurate the new galleries for Oceania. On the left of this shot, this is an aerial shot of the Great Hall. You can see members of the Pacific delegations that we hosted, along with members of New York's diaspora Pacific communities. And on the right, the museum's director and trustees, invited guests, patrons and supporters, and the many staff and colleagues who brought these newly unveiled galleries into the world. We designed the formal opening to weave in stories and contributions from participants from the past as well as the present. Here on the left, Seneca Nation elder Peter Jemison of the Heron Clan, who established formative connections with many of the Kaumatua or Māori elders who had visited the Met 40 years prior for the landmark exhibition Te Māori, which opened on September the 10th, 1984. The Seneca Nation Heron and Turtle Clan representatives welcomed the Moana Nui Pacific delegations to the native territories of Turtle Island. Jemison, Seneca artist, and founding director of the American Indian Community House in New York from 1978 to 1985, joined us in a series of preparatory briefings with traveling delegates and shared the connections he had maintained with many of the Māori elders he had met at the Met back in 1984. I wanted to create this through line from the past as a reminder to our museum leadership of the long-term nature of relationship building, that the event we were hosting that morning had a precedent in events that had taken place in 1984, in fact, just 2 years after the Rockefeller wing that we were reopening had first been built, and that this inauguration was another turn in that continuing cycle of time. This moment then in the Great Hall, an important opportunity to defer to Native and Indigenous Pacific leaders to establish those connections and reanimate their links from over 40 years ago. The delegations from the Pacific on the right of this picture included a group of invited co-hosts who were advisors to the project. Standing here are artists, curators, and colleagues from Papua New Guinea, the Masim Museum in Milne Province, colleagues from the Solomon Islands National Museum in Honiara, to name just a handful. We were able to find extra support and funding to host broadcasters, writers, poets, and practitioners from Hawaii, Fiji, Tonga, and Tahiti, as well as Australia and the West Papuan diaspora in the Netherlands, who stood alongside us as we celebrated the culmination of what was, in the end, a 10-year project from beginning to end. Leading the Pacific delegations through the museum, the Māori and Hawaiian delegation leads opened up a pathway to the galleries, moving beyond the Great Hall through the medieval and European sculpture galleries on our way to the southwest corner of the museum. The karanga and karakia continued, and a wonderful layering of mele and oli, chants and song from all over the Pacific region went up into the rafters of the building, echoing through the museum. A very powerful moment. Having moved through the galleries of Oceania, the delegations and guests gathered under the Cuomo ceremonial ceiling in the new large gallery that overlooks Central Park. And so began the formal proceedings, speeches offered from both sides to weave together the gathering and honor the past in the present, creating new relationships and connections. Lele Lelaulu, the long-term Washington-based Samoan Nobel Prize nominee, was able to join us that morning. Another link to decades before. Lele had been present in 1982 at the original opening of the wing and addressed his remarks to Mary Morgan, daughter of Nelson Rockefeller, former US Vice President and Governor of New York, whose advocacy for the Arts of Oceania led him to create the collection that is the foundation of our galleries. At a time when the arts of the Pacific Islands were largely excluded from the canon of art presented in US museums, Nelson Rockefeller and Douglas Newton, the first chair of the new department that the wing established, were strong advocates for its inclusion. And Lele was able to pull that thread of connection with the past from his association with both men during the time he lived at the United Nations in New York decades ago. The arts of oratory, the arts of gift giving, Sio Olialofa, were on full display under the Cuomo Ceremonial House that morning, with formal speeches and presentations from both sides. Pacifica artists stepped forward to present their gifts, offering chants and song, gestures and oratory, laying them down on the bark cloth rolled out for the purpose of receiving, or placing them directly in the hands of the director and Met trustee Mary Rockefeller Morgan, who had been identified by each senior delegation as the appropriate instantiation of the ancestral lines that were being reactivated in this new iteration of the galleries, and carrying forward ties that were established 40 years ago when the wing first opened. And so the threads of time were pulled into the present with new connections between those formerly present on prior occasions and their younger counterparts or descendants. That's my son on the bottom left, sitting very still as guests come and present their gifts, their koha. One of the most dramatic changes for the Oceania galleries is that they are now organized along a diagonal trajectory. This cuts through the 40,000 square foot print of the wing in a configuration designed to foreground ancestral connections and indigenous temporalities, offering perspectives on art that reach deep into Oceania's past, while also acknowledging ongoing manifestations of its agency in the present. Sharing the space with two other major collections of art from Africa and the ancient Americas, the Met's collection of Oceanic art runs in a dynamic line through the center. And I'm showing here an early rendering of the space while we were figuring out with our architect, Kulapat Jansestrust, how to flow the collection into the floor plan. The Oceania collection is expansive in terms of its breadth and range. We display over 650 oceanic works from more than 140 distinct cultures in a set of 8 galleries, anchored by 2 monumental installations in each of the high ceiling galleries that distinguish the spatial envelope of this wing. That's high ceiling, and this is all lower ceiling height. So our offices actually and storage sit above this area of the gallery. So it's a complex configuration that we had to figure out. The collection gives us a rare opportunity to show the connections and visual resonances of art from across this region. Astonishing artworks created in the last 500 years by descendants of the Austronesian-speaking voyages who settled this last region of the world in waves of migration that began 3,500 to 5,000 years ago. We organize island groupings as far as possible in terms of pre-contact ancestral connections, links born of trade and exchange, voyaging and alliance. Exceptional artworks tell a wealth of stories relating to origins and ancestral power, performance, and initiation. They include architectural works that feature prominently in the ceremonial life of communities from Papua New Guinea, masks, jewelry, and textiles from Australia and the islands of Southeast Asia, stretching to the diverse coastal archipelagos, coral atolls, and volcanic islands situated to the north and eastern extremes of the Pacific Ocean. It's rather like a kaleidoscope. So if the museum is in an encyclopedic, I like to say this collection is rather like the kaleidoscope within that encyclopedia. It shifts. The new gallery design seeks to emphasize the inherent cosmopolitanism of the region, where dynamic interactions have paved the way towards innovation and creativity. It reinforces the long-standing relationships between Austronesian-speaking peoples who are deeply connected, not separated by the ocean. A digital map at the main entrance into the Oceania galleries outlines these connections, plotting the trajectory and earliest migrations of the first inhabitants who walked over land bridges 60,000 years ago to settle present-day Australia and Highlands New Guinea, and the subsequent voyages of Austronesian-speaking navigators who moved easterly through the region, departing Taiwan some 3,500 to 5,000 years ago to settle the Philippines and Indonesia before developing the technology to navigate beyond the horizon, and whose double-hulled outrigger canoes allowed them to reach the large island archipelagos at the farthest extremes of the region by 1200 AD. We invited Hawaiian architect and digital artist Sean Connolly to produce a capstone to the cartographic map, which introduces an important set of visual coordinates, the sphere and horizon lines, and shows how these align in relation to canoes, bodies, and ancestral houses, which operate according to a horizontal or vertical dynamic. This digital graphic, showing on the right now as a screen grab from that, spheric Oceania, acts as a counterpoint to the Cartesian principles of European cartography enshrined in the two-dimensional mapping. Connolly's work interrupts that dynamic, introducing a distinctly Pacific set of relational dynamics to the gallery, which we hope can sensitize visitors at this outset for their journey through the galleries to a set of visual coordinates that align with distinct conceptions of relational time and moving through space in Oceania. The design by our architect Kulapat also helped to reinforce those ideas: horizon lines, the arching dome of the sky, and islands tethered in a vast ocean. For these are the coordinates that guide and shape life in this compelling landscape. The journey through the galleries begins with a soaring installation of Asmat art at the northern end of the wing, as well as the physical and literal voyaging evoked in the canoes and navigational charts on display in this gallery. Label text and didactics reinforce ideas of metaphysical journeying, of artworks as vessels, as material indices through which people can affect relationships. Extending upwards into the top rafters of the gallery and reaching as high as 18 feet, the Asmat bish, or spirit poles that you see in the foreground of this image, are considered conceptually to be upright canoes. These carry individuals across important life stage thresholds, from life to death, for example, or in initiation ceremonies that supervise the development of young boys to assume the full responsibilities of adulthood, which are overseen by their maternal uncles. So crossing these thresholds, these are the kind of tangible remnants of protocol and ceremonial gatherings that we present in the gallery. Newly arranged in a crescent shape, these 9 vertical bish allow visitors to encounter these remarkable carvings in the round. With figures stacked one on another, the dynamic carvings were carved in the late 1950s and are painted with a chalky white paint of calcined lime, whose base is coral or shell, which is applied with a binder. The white color indicates a spiritual status, creating a visual and material link to Safan, the ancestral realm for Asmat, which lies to the west beyond the coastline where the rivers and tributaries empty into the Arafura Sea. The red ochre used to enhance features of the carving is understood to be a hot or spiritually charged color. The first gallery features many of the large-scale works, body masks, sago bowls, and spirit canoes that Michael Rockefeller negotiated for during 2 visits he made to Southwest New Guinea in 1961, when he was a recent Harvard graduate of 23 years old. He recorded the names of the artists he met, taking portraits of them with their work, and noting down specific motifs and explanations of their meaning. This information, along with sketches and correspondence, have been edited into an in-gallery digital feature, which presents important contextual information for our visitors. Using the visual resources and archive in our department, this film highlights the relationships this young man forged with Asmat artists, the ritual experts and carvers who were producing art in New Guinea in the mid-20th century. Here you see Asmat carver Akor and Chief Korwoy with the shields they carved and commissioned, respectively. And at the bottom of the screen, the display of shields in Amanamkai village, July 1961, when artists who had heard upstream of the visit of Michael Rockefeller and the Dutch anthropologist Adrian Gebrans, who he was traveling with, traveled down to join the convoy, bringing their shields with them to the village and requesting they consider them for purchase. Across the new wing, we have made efforts to emphasize authorship, to highlight the names and biographies of artists when we know them. For the Oceania collection, we do have in our records the names of a great many of the artists who made and produced works on display, largely due to their collection history, and that's at each end of the wing for the Asmat collection and the Kwoma collection. So we're able to feature these in our presentation. And the film playing in the gallery allows us to present the unique provenance of this collection and to show through the photos and correspondence left to us in the archive what motivated Michael Rockefeller to go to this region, engage with living artists, and negotiate for artworks. He wrote in his journal of his ambition to present Asmat art as a genre of art worthy of attention in its own right, a spectacular kind of art that he felt, and I quote, would take the New York art world by storm. And he photographed the artists he met and talked to, often with the works they produced, such as this portrait of Tereposh in Omadasep village taken in June 1961, recording the name and meaning of specific motifs and individuals represented in the carving that artists had shared. The gallery feature comes fully up to date with recent photos documenting ceremonial events that continue to this day, such as the arrival of this conical-shaped body mask to Jenny village in July 2015, and portraits of artists and leaders who continue to engage in customary practice throughout this region of New Guinea. These photos taken over the course of the last decade are part of an ongoing collaboration with award-winning photojournalist Joshua Idwandi, who worked on this film along with our digital department. Moving into the lower ceiling height, there are opportunities for close looking in galleries that feature some of the greatest achievements of Pacific artists working in the last 2 centuries. Here on the left, a wonderful headdress made by the highly esteemed carvers of the Tami Islands that features 2 figures kneeling, seen here in profile, their hands resting behind the ankles for support as they lean and bow their head forward, the upward arc of their styled hair extending to support the black panel designed for the head of its chiefly owner. On the right, an iconic kra, or headdress from the Torres Strait Islands, fashioned from cut sections of turtle shell, that features an impressive frigate bird with its wings fully extended as if in flight, and decorated with kapkap, circular shell ornaments, and tufts of black cassowary feathers, which are formally appropriate for its use in ceremony. Torres Strait Island scholar and writer Leah Louis Chivitse shared insights from her own family about the seasonal outings to attract the turtles that were then hunted, and these form part of a new 30-stop audio guide that we produce with the Met's digital team. These prompts animate the galleries with Pacific voices and direct accounts from Indigenous knowledge holders who graciously shared their insights on works they identified in the galleries as pertinent to them. A focal point in the Met's Oceania installation is the iconic Cuoma ceiling, a suspended grid structure that supports over 180 painted panels or pangal that evoke the polychrome interior of a men's ceremonial house in the Sepik River region of Papua New Guinea. Each panel is prepared from the sago palm petiole, which is cut, then wet, weighed down with river stones and laid out to dry, becoming an ideal canvas for painting. Each male Cuoma artist has the cultural authority to depict a specific set of clan designs. These may relate to aspects of totemic clan ancestors, such as a crocodile or cassowary, the flying fox, insects or a bird, the specific attributes of a leaf or plant, or cosmological phenomena, stars and comets. The combination of the panels in their multiplicity creates a cosmological index of the Cuoma universe, each motif a mnemonic for a wealth of knowledge, drawn upon by senior initiated men in the community and shared appropriately during speeches and formal ceremonies that take place under the ceiling. The new layout and interpretation for the Cuoma ceiling in 2025 was configured with input from descendants of the original commissioned artists whose work created the first iteration of this ceiling in the wing. We followed the advice of the current generation of Maliwai village artists, two of whom were able to visit us for the reopening and are pictured here under the ceiling with Shiva Lynn Burgos, the artist who oversaw and managed this consultation. The newly configured ceiling divides the panels per their request according to the village's two clans. So Calabar works are situated south of the central spine toward the windows, and Wanyu works to the north. The Cuoma panels in the Met's collection are well documented as they were commissioned from contemporary Cuoma artists by the first chair of the department, Curator Douglas Newton, in 1971, and installed when the wing first opened in 1982. Produced by 15 artists in Maliwai village in the Washcook Hills of Papua New Guinea, each panel is a mnemonic device for deep knowledge, an effective way for artists and elders to convey foundational stories relating to Cuoma culture and ensure important environmental and cosmological knowledge is passed on and not lost to future generations. Cuoma artists working with Douglas Newton shared the name and meaning behind specific clan designs, and Kathleen Haven, who accompanied Douglas Newton on the field trips they made, took portraits of each artist with their work. And we tell this story digitally in the gallery using an edit of archival images where visitors learn the story of this unique commission, which conceived in the early 1970s and installed in 1982, was, we like to say, the Met's first and largest contemporary art commission. Whilst the consultation and planning took several years to complete, the installation of the newly configured Cuoma ceiling took a team of curators, conservators, and technicians just 3 weeks to complete in the summer before we opened. Working in pairs, going up and down in the rig whilst hanging upside down to tie each petiole, and these are now over 60 years old, so they're very fragile, onto the grid-like superstructure above, was complex. We have a time-lapse capture actually of the install, which is fun and part of an online feature that lives on the Met's website. I want to point out in this image the two large white walls facing the glazed window. Here's one. Here's the other. This is actually the partition. If you go around this corner, the Ancient Americas collection is on the other side of that. But we did build these two large-scale walls facing the glazed window, which were a design feature we evolved with the architect to control and manage light into the gallery. All UV light is now blocked from entering the new glazed window with a Fritz structure. And we have an automated blind, which is triggered when a specific light level is reached and can be manually deployed at will. So these light mitigating walls provided us with an opportunity to create an exciting site-specific commission on the south side of this Poema Gallery. Poised on the museum's boundary with Central Park, Nakas Marks of Matrilinie is a series of copper panels produced as part of a special commission by artist Taloi Havini, who was born in Bougainville, an autonomous region east of Papua New Guinea. Since we cannot easily install art in this narrow corridor adjoining the glazed window due to the light condition, Taloi and I worked closely to develop ideas for a commissioned work that would activate the south side of the gallery and allow for potential transformation from exposure to light over time. This created an opportunity for a conversation about the natural life cycles of people and place in the Pacific, lifeways that are necessarily interrupted by museums whose climate control systems aim to fix and control time. Over the course of site visits and online conversations, the concept of these structures that would interact with the glass curtain wall as a threshold or permeable skin of the museum deeply resonated with the artist. The design of the copper panels evolved to become architectural features that incorporate significant designs that at once shield and protect the historic ancestral objects that are installed in the rest of the gallery. Their etched designs indeed relate to motifs stitched into the tuhu or hood of woven pandanus that the artist received at birth from her female relatives on her father's side. And these inscriptions identify her clan and lineage as Nakas. Havini oversaw a treatment of the copper panels to create a highly patinated cobalt blue, which speaks directly to the highly detrimental decades of extractive, exhaustive mining, copper mining that have decimated the interior of Buka Island, causing the rivers to literally run blue. On Buka Island, where Havini was born, land is conceived as skin, passed down by women and aligned with a complex of ideas that relate to nurturing principles of life and vitality. Healthy skin, like land, must be nourished, watered and cared for if it is to remain glossy, healthy and vital. In contrast, if not cared for, skin or land becomes dry, malnourished and ineffective. The designs chosen by Havini feature prominently in woven objects. There's the tuhu that these designs were based on that she was given at birth. Specifically, the designs stitched onto these customary woven tuhu or pandanus hoods received at birth. So the artist received special permission from the male elders in village council to translate these motifs into a new material that speaks so strongly to the island's history, copper. Reflecting on the naturally ephemeral nature of Pacific artifacts, which are often created and assembled for presentation or one-off presentation sometimes at seasonal ceremonies or performances, then left to naturally decay before being remade the following season. This set of 8 panels are designed to respond to the light in transforming in alignment with the non-linear, cyclical and seasonal notions of time prevalent in the Pacific. The potential for transformation through exposure to sunlight was built into the design spec for these works, which was an interesting conversation with conservators, I have to say, but there's a memo on the acquisition paperwork which speaks to that. Nakas Marks of Matrilinie responds to a rich and varied complex of associations, indigenous systems of knowledge, land as skin, and the harmful consequences of extraction which threaten and transform the land. Like the protective woven tuhu, these copper panels act as another layer, a tangible skin between the outside environment and the inner ecology of the galleries. A significant set of further contemporary acquisitions substantively broaden the media and cultural scope of oceanic art in the Met's collection, where we now present work by senior female artists to highlight the strong living dynamic of customary practice that exists in the region today. New acquisitions include works that expand the curatorial narrative, recalibrating and balancing the strong former focus on ceremonial architecture and men's ritual practice. By broadening the collection to now include the work of women, especially fiber work, including textiles and painting by female artists and senior knowledge holders from Australia and New Guinea. The first installation in a new dedicated space for contemporary Aboriginal art is an important pair of paintings on eucalyptus bark by senior Yolngu artist Nonggurnya Marawili from Arnhem Land in the remote northeast of Australia. This vibrant set of paintings in her elemental Baralcha series are executed in pinks and whites and refer to the rocks and waters of Barachala, where as a child Nonggurnya camped with her father, the renowned Madarpa artist and warrior Mundukul Marawili. In the tropical climate of Northern Australia, fire and water animate the seasons and bring life to the environment, causing the bush to burn, bringing monsoonal rains, summoning lightning and storm clouds, all vital elements that sustain life. Bolts of lightning raised by Mundugul, the ancestral crocodile, who standing upright on his hind legs issues forth lightning strikes from the flickering of his tongue. These elemental forces materialize in Nonggurnya's paintings in the networks of narrow parallel lines that track across the surface of eucalyptus bark, while the trails of dotted lines evoke the spray of salt water crashing off the sacred rock. Shown on the left, Nonggurnya was a key innovator in her use of materials, adding hot pink pigments from the discarded magenta ink cartridges from the inkjet printer in the print workshop to the clays and ochres of her usual practice. The works reflect a lineage of thousands of years of Yolngu knowledge and art, adapted into a vibrant and dynamic contemporary art practice that speaks to innovation and change. On the right, the delegation of the artist's extended family, led by Yolngu lawman Yinimala Gumana, who traveled from Arnhem Land to join us in May last year, and closed the morning's protocols by honoring their relation, Miss Marawili, and acknowledging her works in the new galleries. A series of juxtapositions between newly acquired contemporary works and historic works in the collection are part of a new series of planned rotations in dedicated areas of the gallery. The first of these is a pair of mural prints from Fiona Partington's iconic series from the early 2000s, installed alongside the greenstone heirlooms and treasure boxes in the small Māori display at the heart of the wing. The huia feathers and heitiki evoked in the large format mural prints shown here were produced by Māori and Scottish artist Fiona Partington and create an important dialogue. Partington's decades-long practice has seen her journey into the stores and archives of museums, where her long exposure works create an atmosphere of diffuse light and saturation that emphasize the inner spiritual life, or ahua, of the often orphaned objects. These include long extinct birds, such as the huia on the right, or items like the heitiki on the left, whose provenance is uncertain or unknown, awakening them in a singular and highly personal encounter. Partington will, in fact, represent New Zealand at the Venice Biennale opening in Italy next month. An artist whose practice helps guide visitors in their own thinking about museums, honing criticality to consider the complexity of pathways by which individual items come into collections. Working closely with our project architect, Kulupat Jansastrust of Y Architects, we were able to develop strong architectural features for the gallery design that included our preferences for materiality, casework design with Gopian manufacturers, and a mineralized finish for platforms and their placement, which established a framework to foreground localized ideas of space and time, one that emphasizes connectivity and speaks directly to the distinct ways that Pacific peoples approach life and use art to navigate physical and spiritual worlds. Approaching the galleries as an archive of Indigenous knowledge, as a living library full of power and agency, it was interesting to consider how we might fine-tune that accessibility for current and living generations of descendants. As museum curators, we wrangle daily with the complexities of presentation, figuring how best to wrestle the conventions of display available to us to our advantage, the cadence of glass cases, the density of layout, word counts on labels, which are sometimes, as we know, limited to 75 or 100 words. How can we enlist these parameters to present objects at their most expansive, not in the flattened, thin sense of that term, object, but rather as subjects in the multi-layered expression of the life, ideas, and philosophies that are encapsulated within them, honoring the distinct biographies and life histories that each brings? What strategies can we bring to bear to encourage the galleries as a space for Indigenous epistemologies to take root and flourish? Can we create the right conditions for engagement where abundance and plenitude can be risked, when objects become subjects and vice versa? Collaboration, of course, can help. Here are partners from Taiwan who tied their visit to us with their attendance at the United Nations Working Group for Indigenous Peoples Week. Written and digital narratives in the new galleries elevate Indigenous voices, foregrounding the latest developments in interdisciplinary scholarship and emphasizing the continued creativity of Oceania's Indigenous knowledge bearers. This is just one group of almost 30 that we engaged with over the course of 5 years in the run-up to the reopening. Our new audio guide was produced in collaboration with community partners, animates the galleries and features the insights of these communities, drawn from extensive dialogue with a network of partners across the region. What were long-form conversations on a platform called Riverside, which is a studio quality recording device. It's like a Zoom call, but it's actually recording something that digital can edit. They were edited right down to 90 seconds for each audio stop, but our digital department are formatting them so that their longer form conversation can be held as an archive for the future. The tone and register of writing is also critical, I think. Using opportunities to relay information in formats preferred in the region, from the evocative language of senior lawmen and women, or the repetition and rhythm of oratory and storytelling, are strategies that can encourage visitors into the space on the specific terms demanded by the collection. Leaning into the unique materiality that distinguishes the collection of art from Oceania also gives an immediate way in. From the sago palm fronds and palm petioles, the upturned roots of the mangrove tree used by asthma artists, to the spongy texture of fern trees and vegetable pith favored in Vanuatu and New Britain, the black feathery feathers of the giant cassowary bird, or the tawny translucent plates of the turtle shell. Artists make specific selections according to their immediate environments. And this wealth of fascinating materials gives us clues to the ancestral stories they anticipate telling with them, and the cosmological foundations whose material connotations they index. Shining a light on materials in the galleries unearths Indigenous cosmologies, showing us the other than human species that communities live in relationship with. Foundational ancestral relationships that extend for Kanak communities, for example, in this label, to the first yams that arrived on the shores of New Caledonia generations ago. This genealogical link, it's not just a close one, it's a genealogical one, is foregrounded in this label, where the hierarchy of, I want to go back, actually, no. Where the hierarchy of Kanak chiefs today still follows the order in which those yams, a metaphor for the first generation of humans, arrived and stepped onto the southern shores of their archipelago. So it's recalled in language and material today. Language, tone and register give cues to approach this largely unfamiliar visual world and its interrelated domains, the ancestral, the spiritual, serving also as a reminder, perhaps, that we cannot always alert visitors to the specifics of meaning in the galleries. Rather, we help attune them to distinctive ways of knowing, to get comfortable with a situation where not everything is necessarily available to us as viewers. A reminder that meaning in oceanic art is not to be consumed, but rather unpeeled slowly and shared according to one's status, relationship, and the occasion, where access to knowledge accrues incrementally, earned over the course of a lifetime, then safeguarded, ready to be shared when the appropriate occasion arises. Useful tenets, then, that we can equip our visitors with as they roam the galleries and engage with the collection. Every exhibition or new permanent gallery has an opportunity to prompt critical dialogue. As sites of encounter, museums and galleries, as imperfect as they sometimes are, can provide a critical and creative space where life complexities, historical and colonial injustices, and the precise or uneven coordinates of collection making might begin to be confronted, teased apart, accounted for. The Galleries for Oceania in New York have had the extraordinary legacy of Te Māori to build upon, a landmark exhibition hosted by the Met in 1984 that set important precedents in terms of consultation and shared decision-making between Indigenous communities and museums. Organized by Douglas Newton, he of the Cuomo Commission and the first chair of the department, in collaboration with Māori art historian Hirini Moko-Mead and the American Federation of the Arts, the AFA, Te Māori opened at the Met before traveling to St. Louis, to the De Young Museum of Fine Arts in San Francisco, and then to Chicago's Field Museum, a fourth venue that was added in response to the sellout audiences at each of the earlier US venues. When it returned to New Zealand, a quarter of the population turned out to see it because of this platform that its international viewing had given it. The exhibition has become synonymous with the transformation of Māori art, which was presented for the first time as art, not artifact. Māori Kaumatua elders, seen here on the front steps of the Met's opening on September 10th, 1984, traveled with the treasures, advising on many aspects of their representation in the museum. If Te Māori showed all the way back in 1984 that museums have the potential to become active and dynamic spaces, the contact zone James Clifford spoke of so eloquently, then the intervening years have seen generative models for new museological frameworks grow and evolve exponentially. Many of them structural shifts established alongside First Nations communities in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand in the late 80s and early 90s. The ongoing stewardship of collections requires agile institutions that can adapt and accommodate and hold in play the shifting needs of all its various constituencies. There is nor can be one single model for any museum. We each respond to the specifics of our institutional histories and the generations of practice that have gone before, as we figure out how to make the collections we care for relevant to the issues of today and to the visitors who walk through our doors. And so we end with the beginning, with a closing in Central Park, a carver ceremony that closed a portal, but ensured a new cycle of collective future relationships was strengthened. We sat together, exhausted, uplifted, and elated, leaning into the protocols that re-energize and replenish every time they are enacted. As well as repositories of the past, we know well that collections are living resources for creative interventions that have the power to effect change. Rather than trying to confine collections, a more productive strategy must be to continue to engage them in active and dynamic ways. For now, I hope the galleries help harness awareness that there are ways to live beyond those which we are immediately familiar with, where we acknowledge the possibility of a pluriverse, a world where many worlds fit, one that emphasizes complexity, diversity, yet interconnectedness. An approach that sees the world as a multiplicity of coexisting realities that helps us question the single world narratives that we know do not serve the many and are having a detrimental effect in exhausting the planet. And where we are encouraged to understand our own entanglement with it, our role, perhaps as a more relational one, that comes with attendant responsibilities and obligations. These are all features of life in the Indigenous Pacific. I hope the new galleries might be a first step inside a world where these principles and philosophies are nurtured for some of our visitors and acknowledged as having potential. We hope the updates to architecture, design and layout, new acquisitions in fresh media by senior law women and contemporary artists, and the reinstallation of landmark works that ensure vital threads from past legacies continue into the present will offer visitors strong visual cues for interpreting the collection, at least for a current generation, a few years, until such time as the collection is re-examined and recontextualized once again. And if I'm honest, part of me can't wait to see what issues we've missed, what issues will be pertinent, burning priorities for a next generation of curators that are coming down the line. We each contribute what we can in our time. Thanks very much.
Hi, I'm Tricia Lagasso Goldberg. I'm from Hawaii. Thank you so much for your work. I have so many questions. Where to start? You choose. I'm going to ask a few. First is it's an 8-year project. So where do you start? Right. So that's kind of core to my thinking as a curator. Like, where did you start? Who was your like Avengers team that you put together and you were like, I gotta get, you know, these folks in the room to think through this? I mean, just what was that process like? Being from Hawaii and being of the Pacific, I think about, you know, when you make a checklist of the objects that are going to be included in a gallery, they're bound to be objects that are left out, right? So how do you make that list of the objects, but also the people, right? And I mean, specifically when you're working in Moana Nui, there are, you can get really granular because within even the archipelago of Hawaii, there are many different like cultures and people within that island grouping, right? And that within the Kanaka Oiwi people. So I wonder about that. Like, how did you approach that and selecting these objects on the checklist to tell the story? I could go on, but maybe I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll start there. That's great. So yeah, the galleries have to be, they're led by the collections. It's a really great point. I mean, this collection was made as an art collection in the mid-50s and early 60s by Nelson Rockefeller. So it really, the profile of the collection is really driven by what was available on the tribal art market in that time and where he was, you know, New York art dealers, where he was building his collection, along with Robert Goldwater and René Dalmancourt, who were his advisors. But, you know, so that's really drives what stories you can tell, as you say, what narratives you're going to tell, you know, in a suite of galleries. But essentially, the Met's collection has the kind of, it's comprehensive in the sense that it's got highlights from each of the major art traditions, you could say, right across the board. And it also includes island Southeast Asia, which is something that you see more commonly in the US collections than in, say, European museums. That's usually curated by another specialist curator. But for Oceania, we often include this very kind of broad, comprehensive display, even if there's not a lot of depth in each of those areas, aside from, say, the ASMAC collection for us, where we do have 600 sculptures and body masks, etc., from one culture group. Really, it's a collection that can give you that kind of broad, overarching sweep of history and space and time. So the whole reconception was really driven by what was available to me in the collection. You know, we don't have 6 masks, we have 1, if maybe 2. So it's like you can weave together this kind of overarching narrative. And also where we started is that, I mean, essentially I'm just one curator in a team of 5. There are 2 for the Arts of Africa, 2 for the Ancient Americas, and then an Oceania curator, and the whole wing was being redeveloped. So those early conversations, we just started by talking, but we did go up to Cantor in upstate New York at the Rockefeller Estate. They hosted us for a kind of think tank, and we went for 3 days, I think, as a department, and we just started talking about what we might do if we could. And then because of the infrastructure issue with the glazed wall that looks onto Central Park, it actually became a priority to demolish and reconstruct that. So it was quite strategic on the part of our head of department, Elisa Lagama, to kind of catch the eye of the institution, have it stop on our department and then say, we need to do this. We're clearly not going to deinstall everything and put it back exactly how it was, because each of those collections and art histories related to the 3 collections that make up our wing had evolved exponentially over the course of the 40 years the wing had been open. So it was like the opportunity to change. And so then we went into a kind of fundraising and doing lots of talks to patrons and constituencies to try and get the support. And actually the Central Park Conservancy supported us, and the City of New York really came through with a lot of funding to support the project. So it wasn't really me thinking, what team am I building? I was like one in a big wheel of, you know, this cog that basically played out in terms of how are we gonna not be the non-Western art wing? We pulled apart that acronym of Arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas to kind of consider ourselves 3 different collections. So that was a key part of it, because we were trying to reimagine a wing with, you know, with a kind of cohesive identity as a department, but then distinguish 3 collections within it. So it's kind of complicated. But then I think any renovation is, so it really, that just speaks to the particular specifics of the collection or the wing that we're in the Met.
I have a bit of a follow-up question, if that's okay. Tricia, I should clarify, the book came out 8 years into the project, but it was really a full decade from those first conversations before the opening. And I'm curious, it was so the audio guide is so impressive, the opening was so impressive. Were there other moments as you were conceiving and organizing the plans for the reinstallation when you were able to bring in community perspective or voices, you know, directly in that planning process as well?
I mean, we engage with our local diaspora community of Hawaiians and there's some Marshall Islanders that live in the city. It's not the huge communities that you have here on the West Coast, I'd say. But we worked through our kind of networks of, a lot of them are personal networks that evolve over time. We're quite a small community of Oceanic curators in the museum field. So we, you know, in kind of major museums, I'd say in Europe or the States or Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii. But then we used our connections into smaller grassroots cultural centers, and we just wrote to, you know, those kind of more local model museums in the Pacific. So just writing to them, sending them object lists of what's in the collection, and then just talking, setting up these meetings, giving them time to think about what they might like to talk about, and then recording those longer form conversations. And so those connections just evolved over the course of the project. Yeah. And so each of those delegations that came in May made a very specific point about how this was not the end point in the relationship, but the beginning of ones into the future. So they were also using that moment, I think, to kind of reinforce those connections and play them forward. Yeah. But it's a really complicated time to be bringing people into the country, organizing visas, getting funding for them, and then hosting them well while they're here. That's always something that we, need to resource. So part of those conversations going forward is how we resource this work, because it is complicated and it does require other elements of curatorial practice. And so, that's something that's an ongoing conversation, I think, and challenge, because often there's one curator looking over after a vast, region of the world. And then, how do you do justice to the kind of hosting that is really expected and that you want to do well? So yeah, we were writing letters to the Australian Creative Arts Councils and, national arts councils for each of those countries, and just asking for money. And then, that helped, I think, from their perspective, because they were getting this platform and exposure in a city like New York. So it was kind of bridging the needs of both ends of that.
Thank you. Any other questions from?
Hi, Maya. This is I'm Joanna. I'm the assistant curator of Native American art here at the Cantor. Thank you so much for coming. What resonated with me the most was the way that you are thinking about so carefully about the position within the wing, and like I really like what you said about the use of the windows. And how you are moving diagonally across the whole wing. So my question is how, as you mentioned, you're thinking about how to disentangle these colonial legacies of AOA, and there are these similar threads of othering. So how did you work with your fellow curators working in these distinct areas of the world to create a cohesive wing, but also make sure that people felt that these are distinct areas of the world?
That's a great question. I mean, I think when we started the project, we were kind of more operating from the position of a department of curators and a wing. And then as we kind of moved further down the track, those meetings where we were all involved kind of became more granular and dissipated into smaller curatorial projects with the digital department, with our editor in publications, with the comms team, with education for the programming that we wanted to do, because we had a big festival actually on the Saturday to make the most of all the community members who had joined us. So that's when we kind of became much more, we could become much more specific kind of further down the line. I did notice we stopped having these kind of overarching meetings, and we were really just moving into a period of the project where we got to operate in the way that we felt appropriate for each collection. That kind of triangulated in specific ways, I think. But yeah, in terms of actually distinguishing the three collections, because the museum wanted us to be perceived still as, the wing with its Rockefeller, with this kind of collection history and this foundational collection in this moment when the museum that Nelson Rockefeller had made was kind of like integrated into the museum, which is the moment they say that it became truly encyclopedic. They kind of mark it as that moment. But we used design a lot. We had conversations. So that was one of the challenges that we gave the architect, is like how to have a cohesive experience as a visitor when you walk through the entire wing. But in terms of quite subtle distinctions in color, we have a bespoke kind of font for each of the three collections, slightly different color on the base of the casework, for example. So it's just a way to kind of fine tune the distinction and have them be seen as three different collections. Each collection has a main portal into the space, and then on the left of that is the digital map. So there were these kind of overarching coordinates, I'd say, that were the same for each of the three collections. And then we got to interpret them distinctly at a certain point. So, I mean, it'd be interesting to know how successful those transitions are. And because, you know, it's a complicated space to walk through. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Kristen. I'm a civil engineering student here. I actually went to the museum last summer, so I got to see the exhibit. So this is really awesome to hear your perspective about the process itself. I can say it was successful. I had a wonderful experience. So my dad loved it so much that he actually took a photo of the shields, and that's his now profile photo on WhatsApp. So yeah, that's how cool it was. I wanted to ask, is there some takeaway or learning that you got from this experience that surprised you that maybe you weren't expecting when you first went into it?
It's me. I mean, it was all quite surprising. It was such a roller coaster ride in a way. I think if I had thought too much, I might have been paralyzed by the scale of what we were doing. And I think we just, you know, you just kind of move through it. One thing, you know, in each era, each phase had its own kind of tenor as we, yeah, I guess crystallize our thoughts and things became, you know, the right direction kind of became apparent. The one thing that did surprise me was the amazing response of our colleagues in other parts of the building. So the digital team was so moved by some of the audio conversations. They put our audio guide up for the those Anthem Awards. And so we won the community award because, of course, I told all the Pacific communities that we were up for podcast stroke audio guide, and they just went mad voting for it. So we actually won silver, but we got gold in the community voice. They must have been inundated, but it was, I think you can talk about a lot of the practice that we do as curators in this field, you know, but doing the work, like doing the project, is the best way to kind of sensitize your colleagues to issues that are pertinent to the way you look after a collection and just get people on board. And so people just got it, you know, once you had a 2-hour conversation, you know, 10 o'clock at night with people in a small Pacific island, and they really just, they loved it. So that was just a wonderful, you know, bonus really. But I guess that surprised me because we're in the weeds of it, so we kind of know how that is. But I think just the graciousness and you know, the way that people were sharing and being excited about this project 12,000 miles away just really, you know, was heartening to colleagues in the museum. So it's created this really strong foundation for doing all the projects now with MetLife Arts and the other things that we're doing to build this forward. Because of course you don't want the good work to stop. So, you know, the museum's roving eye has kind of shifted to the other capital projects that are underway in the museum. So it's like considering how you retain some of that momentum and galvanize on it. So, yeah.
I know there was one more question over here. I saw a hand up.
First, I just want to say ngā mihi nui mō tō kōrero I te pōne me tō mahi ki te whāitaonga. I grew up with the old Rockefeller wing as a kid, and it was such a delight to see it as it transformed. And I really felt that transition to what you said about the artifact to the art. And I guess I was wondering, do you see that as something that's like primarily served by the introduction of contemporary art into the wing, or do you see it as a way that you can represent some of what might be more perceived as like an artifact of a traditional object? Do you see yourself kind of shining that light on some of the more traditional objects?
That's really lovely. So I think one of the ways I was excited about was to kind of present these works to give them the kind of sublime treatment, i.e. put them in the case on their own in a space that's elevated in terms of materiality, you know, just to what happens when you strip away a lot of the color or the kind of what has been perceived as these kind of conventions of display, and to kind of shake up, I guess, the conventions of display that this kind of collection is used to. What happens when you strip that away and kind of let them stand on their own and give them space to do that? And so I guess, because I thought a lot when I arrived at the museum about these different frames of museums. And so if the kind of anthropology or natural history museum display has been more alleged to have been more concerned with context, and the art, capital A, museum has been about kind of more formal, you know, attributes, you know, I don't think they necessarily align that simply. And so what I wanted to do, you know, and I think other museums do this as well, is just kind of play with that line. We can, I think, you know, display, present something, yeah, and allow it the space to breathe. We don't have to do away with context. It's just the kinds of access points into the art in the labels. You know, you can guide people through different aspects of it. You just plant the seed of an idea in the first gallery, and then you pick it up in the third gallery, and then by the time they're in the sixth gallery, you hope that it's kind of flourished in their minds. So I think there's a lot to say about, yeah, different styles of display. For me, I wanted just to kind of release them from a kind of history of weighty or a lot of color or light, you know, just to have them sing, you know. So that's what I think we got to experiment with in this gallery. And in fact, they, you know, they really respond well, you know. For me, I mean, I'm looking after monumental work, so you have to give them the space, you know, you have to kind of pull it out and make sure it's not too dense. Yeah, so I think that was a kind of a learning curve. Yeah, we actually had to travel, as you mentioned, 130 works, because the director didn't want to kind of lose focus on the collection while we were closed for construction. And so we did end up, you know, that was quite a big lift for our conservation and collections team and me to suddenly be doing a 2-venue international traveling show. So our collection, like, we went first on a lot of things because this multi-phase project with kind of 3 different collections prioritize our digital, our conservation treatments, our new mounts, because we had to pack up this ship and, you know, this exhibition and ship it overseas. So in a sense, we got to go first on quite a lot of those things. So we learned quite fast what was working and what wasn't. Yeah. And so we got to test out this distilled version of the new galleries in Shanghai and in Qatar, which I found to be very not only rewarding, but because they're completely new audiences, but to test the design out a bit. So by the time we came to install, I felt really good about where we were with it, actually. So then I got to enjoy it rather than be paralyzed. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk, and that was a great question too. I was wondering the same thing. This is just a really nuts and bolts thing. Was it roughly this? Would you say like the same number of works that are on view now that were before? Is it much more? Much? It feels so much. It's just hard to, you know, as a viewer, I went there last year, and it just seems so much brighter and more expansive that I can't quite tell if it's just my perception or if it changed in some way.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's about the same, actually. There are quite a few things that I did bring out that hadn't been out, but we get the bulk of the works really from the 650 plus are the Cuomo ceiling. But actually I think our statistics for the Oceanic collection is about 24% of the collection is out on the floor, which is quite high for museums, as you know. Yeah, it's not 0.5 or 3%. Yeah. So it's not a huge collection, the Oceanic collection that I look after. And in fact, the collection that Rockefeller made was not huge. It's not like other museums. Many museums in the in Europe, for example, that have, you know, the collections made by expeditions to the region in the 18th century and beyond, you know, this really was made as an intentional kind of art collection. So just by scale, it's a lot more contained. So yes, there is about the same out that was before, but we just, I guess it's the lightness of the space that Coolapat helped, you know, elevate, and the great cases that we designed with Gopian. And in fact, those meetings, which were during the pandemic, of course, we're in the pandemic for much of the time that we actually designed it, but the scientific research specifications for the cases were quite demanding of Gopian, and I think they've integrated a lot of those into their own designs now. But the largest line item on the budget for a redo like this is often the casework, as you know. So that's what the museum really invested in. Yeah.